Today's speaker will talk about ideas around negotiating adaptability, dual use, and multiplicity of use in housing. This lecture series takes advantage of the online lecture culture that has accelerated in the last 2 years, but it's also mindful of online fatigue. So we have kept the series very considered and compact with 4 carefully selected lecturers spread across the semester, each one as a 1-hour slot. So with this in mind, Tanzeem Razak, our speaker today, is a SOAP alumna, as is Duzanne Dupel, who is our 3rd speaker in the series, who will speak about exploring resilient architectural strategies on the 7th of October. The next lecture on the series is on the 9th of September, so there are wide gaps between them, and will be Luanda Zaso, an author and human rights lawyer and founder of the forum Including Society. Luanda will talk about building and belonging, how spaces can support community. The final lecture will be by Mark Throne, co-founder of the architectural practice FAR, which is based in Berlin and Santiago de Chile, and that will be on the 28th of October. So I hope you can attend all of the 4 lectures in the series. I would now like to introduce our speaker, architect Tanzeem Razak. After graduating from WITS, she went on to do a master's in architecture from Leuven University in Belgium, where she graduated cum laude. Tanzeem, with Althea Peacock, are the founders of the practice Lemon Pebble Architecture and Urban Design. The practice is based in the inner city of Johannesburg and deals with architectural and urban issues around social change and spatial transformation within the contentious post-apartheid landscape. Lemon Pebble have been entrusted with the most daunting of tasks of rethinking and remaking the architecture of the School of Architecture and Planning year. So that alone is quite a distinction. But Tanzeem is distinctive as an architect who straddles academia and practice. She's an experienced, astute, constructive, and highly sought after critic and examiner, and has had extensive and numerous such involvement at various architectural schools. She's passionate about urban design, not in the sense of drawing perimeter blocks and avenues of trees, but in terms of learning from the city of Johannesburg with all its idiosyncrasies, diversity, and complexities, and through this process offer urban interventions that are transformative. This is part of her strong ethos around an architecture for social change. Her work in the world and her thinking is a praxis through lived experience, an embodiment of someone grounded and deeply connected to her background from a township in the East Rand. Professor Ian Lowe, in a recent online conference, spoke of the need for radical humanity in architecture. This, I believe, is something Tanzeem strives for through the empathy she displays in her work, and I'm hoping can translate to the students amongst us today. Just to say, we will have time for questions after the presentation, but I will now hand over to Tanzeem today. Just to say,
with the kind of thinking that I have, I didn't. You put it quite eloquently. I didn't think half of that, but thank you very much for that, Nabil. And I'd also like to thank SOAP and the Honours Year team for hosting me on this program on this platform. Okay, so maybe I'd like to start and say, ever since I started practicing, I've always been fascinated by 2 things, and that no matter what the project is, it's always affected by housing in some way. And number 2, that the longer I'm in practice, the more the spatial patterns around me remain the same. Monofunctional areas, mono-use spaces that repeat historic patterns of the past. So today I would like to speak to the idea of housing, home, and the multiplicity of use. I'd like to go to the next slide, but so historically, we have inherited a segregated landscape that defines our geography. These spatial patterns remain stubbornly in place with a commercial area in the center and the concentric circles of segregated housing settlement that spiral outward with the buffer zones that separated them. Ultimately, the apartheid city plan is really a racialized modernist plan, With its modernist zoning, it enabled planners to legally demarcate sections of the city for different isolated functions along strict functional lines. Public health usually was cited as a rationale for keeping cities organized or racialized in our case. The result was a sanitized, single-raised dormitory town at edges of the city, defined by single houses per plot. There was no recreation areas or social amenities and no commerce. This resulted in a high transport cost to the city center, locking its inhabitants in a cycle of poverty. A sea of anonymous houses stretching across the landscape without social infrastructure or commercial activity to drive the community or build the local economy. These dormitory towns remain highly unsustainable, with limited solutions proposed for the change in the future. So the smallest building block of the city was its housing units at its most standard. A four-room unit composing of a living room, 2 bedrooms with a toilet, a bathroom, known colloquially as the matchbook house or the 51/1 house. These were in a form of detached or semi-detached within a single structure to a site. Standardization was the root of the plan. The grand apartheid plan of forced removals and dislocation would not have been efficient if it not for the standardization and mass implementation. Even in the native housing, it was said, there is everything to gain and nothing to lose from reducing these non-European houses and many other parts to a limited range of standard sizes and shapes. These were advocated for the published thesis proposal from native housing. Even Calderwood, whose Wits thesis became the basis for township planning, and the 51-stroke house acknowledged that a well-designed house is far from being the only desire of a family. The housewife may be contented in her well-equipped kitchen, but if she travel long and uncomfortable distances to purchase a provision, her contentment is short-lived. The child who has to traverse dangerous traffic routes on a journey to school or playing field causes the parents great anxiety. Where children are forced to play in the street because no recreation grounds exist, dissatisfaction arises and the desire for a better environment results. This means that the amenities beyond the dwelling are equally important as the home itself. It is interesting to note that even the South African Institute of Architects at the time, I think it was 1951, contributed to the non-European housing question evidence in this publication. They proposed through a competition a plan not dissimilar to the larger form of a 51/9 house, but with the additional architectural features that had the potential to turn the matchbook house into a potential home through the architectural features of a defined covered flagstone entrance, overhangs, and landscaping. So has anything changed? Very little, it seems. Images taken of RDP houses in Tekoza in the last decade harks back to Soweto in the 1950s. Plans of a notorious 51-stroke house display little innovation or change from its contemporary equivalent of the RDP house, albeit only a little bit larger in size. But then the 51-stroke series also had a larger unit similar to this. But more concerning, though, is the private development units for sale last year in the East Rand for about 500,000. That's a replica of the RDP plan and sold on under the guise of a secure thematic enclave, also at 48 square meters. So Rahul Malhotra said that I think modernism has not taught us a way to view the past and integrate it into the future and the present. It hasn't taught us the differences that exist in a city versus looking at it as a singular ideological stance. So the way we design our cities and housing continues to create monotonous single-use settlements far from the economic center, replicating patterns of the past. Same. Alejandro Arivana says that the challenge of architecture is to be capable of departing from the outside of architecture in that environment of ambiguous problems that really matter to society. So in 2019, the World Bank identified South Africa as the most unequal country in the world. The report found that 1% of South Africans own 7.9% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 60% only control 7% of the country's assets. This inequality has a spatial dimension to it, with the majority of the bottom 60% relegated to the edge of the city far from economic opportunity, thus allowing the city to develop unequally and reinforcing the idea of a segregated spatiality between the haves and the have-nots. Nolene Murray describes the dividing line as a divide between the anxious rich and the desperate poor. She highlights, arguably, due to colonialism and apartheid, Johannesburg still mirrors the fragmentary and unsettled qualities of fractured urbanism, where the production of urban space is the outcome of an unstable mixture of opposing fields of force, where the latent tensions between the anxious rich and the desperately poor are completely out of sight and occasionally conflict in the most unexpected spaces. So the statistics in Johannesburg are quite staggering. There are 15,000 people that are homeless and living on the streets. There are 30,000 living units required for vulnerable people. And there's a 1.2 million applicants on the Amazing Word for the Johannesburg area alone. And furthermore, stats say that 13.9% of South African households live in informal settlements. So as architects, we have quite limited skills to address these issues, but as a practice, there are some questions we'd like to ask. How do we at least not reinforce the spatial patterns of inequality? How do we challenge the basic building block of the house and create spaces to address issues around shelter, function, efficiency, and need within the multiplicity of use? How do we contest historical patterns so as not to repeat the past? How do we challenge projects beyond the inherited brief to create layers of alternative use, flexibility, and contestation? How do we go beyond the brief? So as practitioners, we are the lowest rung of the development hierarchy. The traditional triad of housing, the location, budget, program, are predetermined by others. Locations are bought by owners of or government agencies, budgets strangled by engineering efficiencies, and programs determined by outside visions. But as Neutlings Razak, the Dutch team, the Dutch team advocates as their design philosophy, the traditional trinity of housing, brief and program determines how dwelling units are to be arranged. Within these restrictions, there's plenty of variety to be had. You live above or below, at the front or the back, in the sun or the shade, looking out or looking in. The arrangement of living spaces gives direction to your life and quality to your home. So in my journey to learning, my first exposure to houses and issues around multifunctional urbanity was a young graduate in the Office of Novarro Wharf Architects. The practice had just won a major competition for the first apartheid museum in New Brighton in Port Elizabeth. So New Brighton was a historical township that suffered from ravishing poverty and no development. So in the context of inserting a mega project, that of the first public museum that captured the narrative of apartheid struggle heroes, and without necessary infrastructure to support the development, would have been the antithesis of democratic intentions of the project. So the new infrastructural project included the new road, trading stalls, and importantly, social housing. Rows of 48 square meter, two-story units were created facing the museum to create an urban edge. Ablutions, the ablutions were on the ground floor with circulation on the outside to allow for rentable units on the upper floors. Acknowledging the resourcefulness of locals, the units accommodated for change and flexibility for expansion by making easily permeable and adaptable, allocated by the corrugated iron walls at the backs. A continuous public facade was created with attention given to finish to create a sense of belonging. Special attention was paid to the corner units to encourage spaza shops and alternative public uses. The permeable black wall created the opportunity for backyarding, and rental opportunities was created as part of these units. More attention was paid to the entrance threshold to allow for a public-private interface. So in 2017, Bjarke Ingels came to Johannesburg as part of the GSA lecture series and was received as a rock star. So having worked for Cool House, he was an advocate for principles, putting contrasting functions in the same place, creating multiplicity of use, saying that by mixing traditional ingredients, retail, row housing, and apartments in untraditional way, you created added value, if not gold. By the time of his visit, Ingels had recently designed the largest housing development in Copenhagen in the new suburb of Orista, the 8 House. So the 8 House was a project to rethink the traditional row housing of Copenhagen. The project was part of a larger development of Overstad, a new suburb that was imagined as the Dubai of Denmark, alluding to the fast-growing development of the edge city designed by the best local architects, selling the idea of easily accessible urban life in the countryside. I think this slide is quite light, but as a contrast to traditional historic town, the large boulevards served as a design. Large boulevards were designed with perimeter block housing. Bjarke Ingels designed the 8 House scheme at the prime site at the edge with a typology of a perimeter block, but twisted it in the middle of form to an eight shape that defined two internal courtyards. So the roof was designed as a green roof with an adjacent running track that was meant to be open to the public. The sloping 10-story building provided views over the fields and marshes to the south. The ramp, looking around the complex, was designed to foster a sense of community, encouraging interaction between the neighbors. The retail and commerce area at the base consisted of a cafe, a daycare center, and offices, while the living spaces with houses, apartments, and apartments were positioned above. So Engels liked to say, where social life, the spontaneous encounter, and a neighboring interaction are traditionally restricted to the ground level. The 8 House allows them to expand that all the way to the top. The resulting environment, according to the firm's promotional literature, is a lively urban neighborhood with the intimacy of Italian town. However, upon visiting in person Overstad, the 8 House was not quite the urban, lively neighborhood as Ingels purported it to be. The suburb itself, with its large boulevards, was wind-swept and deeply difficult to navigate, even in the summer, as pointed out by the local architects who took us on this tour. The individual buildings, while interesting in their own right, were quiet and mostly monofunctional, including the envisioned high street, possibly due to its very, very large scale. The building itself also didn't appear to function as well as it was advertised. The courtyards were empty, and even in summer, the public commercial floor on the ground floor was fenced off. And while the cafe was active, due to its prime location and beautiful views, the rest of the building was not functioning as envisaged. Even the running track was closed, as the architect taking on tour outlined, closing permanently as the residents complained due to the lack of privacy. So we're looking at the cafe that was partly functional. So when referring to a large scheme based on real estate development model to address healthy urban environments, Kevin Campbell and Robert Cohen in their book Radical Incrementalists say that big architecture has never solved this problem, referring to the housing issue, even when a design is of a high standard. Cities need the richness that a fine grain delivers. Big name architects don't create social diversity. So big solutions are a lazy way of dealing with complex urban issues. Campbell and Cohen go further by layering the issue of the lack of social cohesion in large urban schemes at the door of local governments that advocate for their responsibility, that abdicate their responsibilities. They say it seems to run to a big procurement process and give it to someone else to support out for the government to take the lead. Government has lost confidence in its own ability to make a difference. So as an example of exactly this sentiment is our own local example of Waterfall City, where the government's inability to provide services and housing delivery has resulted in a private city sucking the growth and energy of the inner city 25 kilometers away. So 25 kilometers away from the inner city, Waterfall is the largest single private development in South Africa. The land is leased on a 19-year lease even to its individual owners. It is a city that it has its own hospital, schools, mall, and office towers. Waterfall has created by public-private partnership with the owners, Waterfall Islamic Trust, by providing infrastructure and the leasing of individual sites. So Waterfall City is made up of 22 hectares of thematic enclaves, 27 kilometers of walled city with a 45 billion rand worth of state-of-the-art infrastructure. And the Waterfall Islamic Trust, which owns the land, is pointed out, acts as a self-governing enclave out of the reach of public oversight. Even the taxis are limited to the main thoroughfare and are not allowed through the other spaces. More concerning, though, are the private estate rules that means domestic workers are registered with the estate and are not allowed to roam freely unless on duty. Quite reminiscent of previous past laws we've looked at closely under the guise of safety and security. So we have worked in this development on a site that could possibly even fit 50 township stands. As a practice, we are acutely aware of our complicity in the service of the haves by creating insta-worthy luxury housing on various private developments like Waterfall. Whilst the real need lies elsewhere in the inner city and its margins, where the real issues facing Johannesburg are outside these concerns. So in a context where the poor and vulnerable remain marginalized on the edge of the city, we try to work in a space that questions established housing typologies in an attempt to challenge conventional responses to it. We tested multiple housing scenarios in areas of limited resources and intense need that have been met with varying degrees of success on our side. One of the first projects we undertook was in the inner city in Berea. It is a highly dense urban environment that is usually a base for entrance for foreign nationals close to Ponty. The project comprised of two existing blocks, one a five-story office block that was converted into 67 two-bedroom units. The original block, or the smaller block, was a heritage residential block of some value. And due to its limitations of reconfiguring a heritage building, the internal spaces were converted into three room types for two people with communal facilities for cooking and ablutions. The taller block of 67 family units from an existing office block had to be made fire compliant due to the lack of funding and the need for communal spaces in such a high intensity, like creches and recreation room, which went unheeded. So that's the smaller unit, the heritage unit, the before and afters, the taller 67 unit one. We couldn't get good pictures, but that's the parking in Spiros. So despite being managed by the development agents Tuft, 2 years later, the building was hijacked as security was overwhelmed and the tenants didn't know each other and didn't realize that their rental was being diverted to other sources. The other project was located on a main corner in the inner city on Main End Street. The existing it was an existing and light retail industrial building, which was converted into mixed-use building. The existing single retail shops was made into smaller retail units on the ground floor with an arcade, you can see, and smaller shop units were made to accommodate entry-level trade and variety. On the upper floors, 40 square meters to 20 square meters living units were created. But due to the depth of the building, more efficient layouts were not feasible, resulting in larger units creating in 4 large unit types, as indicated. An attempt was made by ourselves not to compromise the integrity of the existing building, but by working within the architectural facades. Bromfisherville. In a township called Bromfisherville, approximately 23 kilometers from the city which was on the edge of a mining dump, you can see on the left, the development was located in the middle of the township. The other idea was to create economically viable rentable stock within a block with a distinct identity, but that was still part of the township and not creating an island enclave. So here 6 typologies were created, including shops on the corners and the edges, and 2 to 3 story blocks with single bedroom blocks of varied layouts. Deliberate configurations were designed along the urban edge with opportunity for growth and expansion. You can see that we're looking at the different varied units. These allowed for different growth and implementation over the years. Umzawethu. Located in Protea Glen, Soweto, the Umzawethu Hostel was part of a training facility which we were appointed to refurbish as barracks for the SAPS. The typology was for a single male SAPS officer, part of an old hostel model. The condition, I'm showing you the worst one here. The conditions of the existing buildings were atrocious. A 14 square meter room was often occupied by 4 people, and bathroom facilities were communal as well as the cooking areas. These were not ideal as the inhabitants preferred to cook in the rooms, making the kitchen obsolete and the room fire hazards. No accommodation was made for females or the differently able. As part of the upgrade, 156 family units were created instead of the single units varying in shape from 14 square meters to 43 square meters, allowing for accommodation for families to occupy, this time round, regulated units while still maintaining flexibility. Communal spaces, let me go to the next. Communal facilities like outdoor areas and gardens were created with circulation as well as public open spaces outside. Clear Lake. In a more suburban setting of Roodepoort, a housing developer required gap housing model, requesting 2-bedroom units within a walled enclave. Here we were adamant that we should not perpetuate the suburban model, instead proposing a multi-use, multi-story, multi-tenant type as an alternative model. 7 different housing types were proposed, centered around outdoor communal spaces as well as community recreation center that faced the street, and a corner being dedicated to retail blocks with living units above. A variety of 3, 2, and 1-bedroom units were created in varied block types of perimeter blocks.
Construction.
Row housing and semi-detached houses to meet the required density. And we tried to create, so these are the different units. Just
See.
on the side. And bearing a relationship to a street. Okay, Cape Town. Like most of our cities, Cape Town has little or no access for living units for the working class due to high rental costs. NGOs like Reclaim Cape Town have been actively campaigning for access for inclusive housing in the city. As part of a larger team, we, along with members of JUSCO and SAPOA, made a speculative proposal for a controversial site opposite the Cape Town Convention Center. The site had been controversially sold for a hotel development in a contested sale, and various stakeholders were holding out for its end. The site was one of the only remaining open sites in Cape Town. This prime land was key to unlocking and refocusing development in the inner city. The team speculated on a high-rise proposal for housing in the inner city of Cape Town, creating 32 floors of housing that varied. 3 different types of house were included, that included affordable housing, 2 and 3 bedroom units, executive apartments, and penthouse units right at the top. Green communal facilities were provided at every foot level. The ground floor was made of urban connections to other arcades and public spaces, while the upper floor was dedicated to different forms of housing. And we placed the site in a cityscape with the Cape Town mountains as a backdrop. So as Sir David Ajay advocates for, he says, you know, the successful plans like London, etc., is the ability to put the rich and poor together so that there actually is an aspiration always, and there is humility as well. Place memory, the manor house. Haydn, in her book Power of Place, says that social memory relies on storytelling, but what specialists call place memory can be used to help trigger social memory through the urban landscape. Place memory encapsulates the human ability to connect with both the built and natural environments that are entwined in the cultural landscape. It is the key to the power of historic places to help citizens define their public past. Places trigger memories for insiders who have a shared common past, and at the same time, places often represent shared past to outsiders who might be interested in knowing about them in the future. So this project was undertaken as a collaboration between Lemon Pebble Architects and Green Brick Designs. It was for the rehabilitation and adaptation of an existing house on site, which I call a manor house, for the Sydney Brenner Institute for Molecular Biosciences, an institute at Wits University. The Mount, as it was called, built in 1910, was located on Jubilee Road as one of the first sites established in Parktown, Johannesburg. The brief was to refurbish the house to suit the need of the new tenant, as the intention was to find a permanent home for the Sydney Brenner Institute within the new urban development framework. The university was keen that the building reflects its mission to see the institute at the forefront of research and development. So Jubilee Road was built in 1897, where a distinct political and economical hierarchy existed. So Parktown was an exclusive suburb at the time that was gated and housed the affluent landlords. The landlords that moved from the south to settle on the ridge to escape the dusty mining camp below. The area was established as an elite area for the privileged, with Jubilee Road being the promenade where you could ride along and show off your Sunday best. Access to the public for the suburb for black miners and the less privileged who lived in camps below was severely restricted. So Jubilee Road occupied the highest point on the boundaries of Parktown, also acting as the frontier line to the rest, as we imagine as a frontier line to the rest of Africa, as we demarcated it in red. The Mount was positioned on the highest vantage point, privatizing the most extraordinary view of Johannesburg. The landlords also had a vast pool of regimented, strictly controlled servants of other races, which maintained the area as an enclave of private privilege. The mark and impact of these servants remain subverted and documented. Again, Haydn, she advocates that a politically conscious approach to urbanity must go beyond the techniques of architectural preservation to reach broader audiences. It must emphasize public processes and public memory. This will involve reconsidering strategies for the representation of women's history and ethnic history in public spaces, as well as the preservation of the place itself. So our urban approach was to relook and rescript the history that was entrenched in the spaces and to excavate the impact of the lost narratives that made these elite enclaves possible. The intervention explored through researching and excavating the various layers of history, overlay them to allow for a multiplicity of readings. We unpack the idea of creating a metaphorical frontier line, as alluded to before, by marking the highest topographical point. We acknowledge that the manicure line indicated the history of wealth and privilege of the time, because the south facing lawns are the key privilege of the site. Jonathan Kane, in his recent book Civilizing Grass, says the lawn is not quite as innocent as we might hope to think. Lawns suck up scarce water, consume chemicals, displace innocent indigenous plants, and reduce biodiversity. And they are also part of a colonial lineage of dispossession and violence. They reduce the political problem of the land to the aesthetic question of landscape, thereby obscuring issues of ownership, redress, belonging, and labor. The question then becomes, who mows these lawns and in what clothes, under what condition, and for what reward? So our idea continued to be that the idea to rescript the civilized ground by inverting the meaning of the frontier line as a soft green line of a natural indigenous vegetation, and invert the original narrative of overlaying the memory of organic indigenous landscape upon the more historically ordered and largely exploited landscape. So that's the indigenous landscape that we tried to overlay. We also try to create an urban edge where the manicured lawn of the manor house is contested by a strong urbanity. The urban edge proposed was to create a line of institutional buildings from the street, which links the two Wits University campuses, which is Med School and the business schools, to form an institutional corridor along Jubilee Road. The institutional band was further dissected by breaking the strip into smaller buildings that makes the view along the ridge accessible to the public. So the manor house typology of the single large mansion within a vast landscape was typical of the affluent suburb. The segregated lifestyle of the affluent was played out within these spaces. The servile staff were completely separated from the residents of the house with separate entrances from those who resided on the property and lived in cramped quarters adjacent to the stables. So these were the stables and the coach house, and on the left-hand side was a small area for the staff. The power relations of the employers and their black staff was evidently clear. The public nature of the institute allowed its original purpose of a private house for a privileged individual to evolve into a site that is accessible to all. And in order to deliberately invade the power relations of the original, the main function of the institutes were housed in the staff quarters and the stables, which were the labs. And the cramped staff areas in the main house were opened up and all areas were made accessible. So this image is the main house. Particular attention was paid to the northern facade of the main house, built right on the edge of the ridge, overlooking an expansive view, which effectively privatized one of the best views of Johannesburg. We effectively wanted to challenge the appropriation and invert the power play by excavating the northern facade of the house and inserting a glass box, but a series of excavation by uncovering that was there before and putting new by layering it. With this glass box, the Institute would accommodate the most public entities of the brief, the library and the boardroom. The original columns that had been covered and some were demolished were uncovered and reinstated. The intention was to deliberately layer the uncovered remnants of history. The newly designed glass and steel box was deliberately shifted off its axis to acknowledge the difference of its colonial past and reflect the new democratic history and function of the building. It has an added intent to invert the meaning by making it most public space of the Institute. You can see by the drawings that are in. So the project has been going on for a few years as the growth of the institute happens. So the second stage of this project was due to the growth of the institute and the need for another lab. A new lab was designed and shifted to the side to acknowledge the view line set out previously, which connected lightly to the existing lab housed in the coach house. The ground floor housed the labs, while the upper floors the new open plan offices. So a simple box was designed so as not to distract from the main house as the institute. So while the facade acknowledged the position of the old coal store that had been erased and only its foundation remained, the remaining brick were used in a staircase, and the new box with the bag plaster below pays homage to its history. And images of the box relative to the stables. So we hope that Jubilee Road, with its growing abandonment, begins to contest the inherited residential streetscape. Erasure and restoration. Again, Haydn. Urban landscapes are the storehouses for social memories because streets, buildings, and patterns of resettlement frame the lives of many people and often outlast many lifetimes. Decades of urban renewal and redevelopment of a savage kind have taught many communities that when an urban landscape is bettered, important collective histories are obliterated. Yet, even totally bulldozed places can be marked to restore some share of public memory. So this project, number 3, Kotze Street in Braamfontein. So number 3, Kotze Street was a derelict building, Johannesburg, Braamfontein, that we as Lemon Pebble Architects, within a joint venture with Kate Orton Architects, were appointed to rehabilitate as transitional housing for the Johannesburg Development Agency. So transitional housing is a limited period housing provided for people who find themselves without accommodation while still looking for a permanent place to live. The building was a clear representation of the abominable conditions in which black workers were housed before and during apartheid. The clients required that the building should be transformed into a functional accommodation as transitional housing for a limited 2-week stay for those in need. So number 3, Kotze, formed part of the native section of the old Johannesburg Hospital. And the building originally functioned as a native compound, for want of a better word, and a hostel for the single black male staff of the hospital who were separated from their male counterparts, from their white counterparts. The building itself was a utilitarian 4-story block with ablution facilities separated from the main building and connected by a bridge. Built in 1938, this building was a typical hostel typology that accommodated black workers before and during apartheid. So the historical value of the building, however, does not lie with its architecture, which is simple and utilitarian, but rather in its social narrative. Its real significance lies not in its architectural value, even though it forms part of the Joburg heritage building stock, in a city that is notorious for demolishing heritage buildings, but rather for its social history that represents number 3 Kotze as one of the few hostel buildings that still existed in its original form in Johannesburg, other than the Workers' Museum in Newtown. It represented the workers' history of Johannesburg and the atrocious conditions in which they were housed. What distinguished the hostels was the indignity of the living conditions of the men housed there, which was still evident in its original form. Concrete platforms that acted as beds were crammed into small spaces that housed more than it could reasonably accommodate. Other dormitories were concrete slabs as bunks with secure lockers above, and the doors were short stable doors that provided no closure and no privacy. Access to these rooms were through a shortened stable door that afforded no privacy for the men who resided there. But perhaps the most reflected is one of these images are the ablution facilities with no doors that had access. The toilets and showers were completely public and open to view, even from the public spaces. The toilet stalls had no doors with low dividing walls, and the showers were open spaces with shower heads above in the same space as the toilets. But perhaps the most evident reminder of pre-apartheid, as well as apartheid era spatial justice, was the lack of a front door. The building faced the street, but despite that, the inhabitants were forced to access the building through the deliberately created back entrance. So this is the back entrance. What we did in its rehabilitation was to mark the new interventions to make legible and physical the differences between the space of the new and the old. All new interventions were clearly made legible as such and should enhance the create an awareness of the cultural and historical significance of the structure on the spaces. This was done by clearly marking all the new work as green so that the transformation was clearly visible and legible. This included the creation of privacy of adding doors, lengthening doors, and creating privacy barriers where there were none. And secondly, and perhaps the most importantly, we tried to restore the idea of dignity, which was previously stripped for the occupants by the creation of a front door. The new interventions were created to create a new identity for the space by creating a new entrance coming off Kotze Street. The intention was to create a dignified front door, an entrance to the building, and giving it a green and habitable and opening identity. The idea was to rescript the past and invert its original meaning and use of the building where the residents had very little interaction with the streets outside and entered through the back door by exaggerating the new front entrance in its green form. It is by this strategy that we wanted to capture the power of the place and to make the narrative physical and visible, as seen by these images. Private spaces in public buildings. In 2015, we were approached by the DPW, Department of Public Works, to rehabilitate and renovate a 3-story building in Braamfontein on Steeman Street that had been abandoned in order to create a new documentation center for the Department of Home Affairs. The brief requested the public for a permitting office on the ground floor, adhering to strict home affairs requirements, and offices on the upper floors. So this is as they envisioned a very public and stringent requirements of home affairs. This is the basement level with limited parking, and the upper floor with both cellular office and open plan. This is the proposal as per the design request. So as part of our feasibility study, we motivated that the building was not reaching its full potential in a high density area like Braamfontein, and proposed that a building be raised to its full 13-floor height, with the lower ground given to public functions and affairs, and the upper floors as offices, while the remaining 9 floors to be made into residential functions. The project managers were loath to challenge the brief, as the bureaucratic process and system just didn't allow for it, as a rehabilitation project cannot become a capital funded one. They also cited the lack of parking for the denser approach, despite Braamfontein being extremely accessible by way of public transport. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for any changes, despite head office being quite excited about our proposal as a speculation. The project remained on someone's desk for about 8 years. Interesting enough, though, the project was reinstated tentatively during the last few weeks, as COVID has made the DPW rethink a lot of its previous concerns. Public buildings and private spaces. A Childhood Development Center in Fosurus. In 2017, we were approached to develop a prototype for the Early Childhood Development Center for Ekurhuleni, located in Fosurus. The initial site was proposed that was along the major thoroughfare that was highly commercial, not providing the security and safety required for young children. The ECDC was envisioned for a learning center and a creche for children from toddlers to 6 years old. So like the previous project, we challenged our original location and recommended that the ECDC be located in a more residential areas where they would be embedded in the local community. Unlike the previous public client, our motivation this time was heeded and a new site was allocated. I initially had reservations about the satellite taxi rank adjacent to the site, but social development as the user client highlighted that it was quite a good location, as caregivers and parents are able to drop off their children on the way to work, making it highly efficient. The idea of the ECDC was to embed it within the locale and create a distinct sense of belonging and safety for children, as well as creating a public facility going beyond its initial function, creating a community venue for after hours as well. The brief was to rationalize the original plans, which were become inefficient, and was create a more legible and efficient layout, which would be easier for the emerging contractors to build. What we did was to straighten out the curved shape of the original plan to create functional blocks around communal spaces that would open up into larger open spaces for community functions. And these are the outdoor, more public open spaces in which the communal spaces open up to. And the enclosed courtyard, which was for the younger toddlers in the nursery to play safely in. The plan was rationalized with a classroom to the north to maximize daylight and offices to the east and service blocks to the west wrapped around a courtyard. South of the plan was a nursery function, safe and secure away from the older children. Color was used as a wayfinding device that demarcated each classroom as a way for a child who yet cannot read to locate themselves. Volumes were also used to create spatial sense for the public spaces having large volumes. And these are the public spaces and accessibility and wayfinding devices. And the classrooms were reduced to a more intimate scale. But ultimately, the intention really was to make an accessible public space that locates itself squarely in the community and created a sense of belonging for the community. So in conclusion, I take inspiration from a quote by Margaret Mead in the book Radical Incrementalist. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, concerned people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And herein I find my inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanzeem. Wow, a really thought-provoking journey through what house and home means for the city of Johannesburg, by and large, and debunking some of those myths, which I hope students will see about the glamorous kind of magazine architecture around housing. So I really appreciate it. I love the depth that you've gone into, but specifically the kind of insight you bring in, which has empathy and sensitivity. I think that the kind of radical humanity that Ian Lowe was referring to came across really well, and I hope the students pick up on that. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm seeing a hand, or I don't know how to. Sorry, Vishal Namdi. Namdi, do you want to ask a question? Since you are the head of school, you can go first.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Nabil, Kiki, and Patricia for organizing this, and thank you, Tanzeem from Lemon Pebble for giving us this great lecture. We are most appreciative. I'll make my question brief. Can you talk a little more about the title of your paper? How did you come about it? Same, and how you tie it to this lecture that is full of energy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Namdi. Yeah, so same is a township colloquial term, where it's an exaggerated term that means like it's exaggerated sameness. And I thought it was quite relevant in this time that in my own learning, things change, the context changes, but everything stays the same. And unless that, so there's a real dilemma as contestation as architects, and particularly those of us in practice that that received, as I pointed out, predetermined briefs and ideas. So we have very limited tools and to make change or create change. And even those small things, like in terms of housing, where we have to create balconies or creches or communal centers, are disregarded by creating by hiding behind either safety and security or engineering efficiency, therefore almost strangling us as levels of innovation. So we also have this other part where we have this deep need for what I think is real problem solution creating architecture, which is in contestation with this very superficial Instagram worthy world that we live in. So even us as architects, and even in preparation of this, you're so tempted to put up these images of that create that show difference and flamboyance in the hope that it might show diversity or change. But in reality, when you peel away the layers of superficiality, in the core use of buildings, and particularly in housing, it's actually just the same. So what I would like to, for us, it's always this deep struggle, and it is really a struggle to put out things that are not as glamorous as a magazine architecture, but in reality, in practice, is really what needed in order to make change. And what I've realized is that we are in a very special position as architects in South Africa, in that the smallest change we have this huge butterfly ripple effect. So what we create obviously lasts for more than 50 years and go and beyond that. But if that's a positive change by creating meaningful public interfaces, then that change is worthy, no matter how small and irrelevant it might look on the surface.
Thank you.
Thank you, Namdi. Vishal, your hand was up, but I don't know. I see it's down now. Do you want to ask a question? Sorry, it's a bit. Sirak, do you want to ask a question? Please go ahead, Sirak.
And thank you so much, Bill, and thank you also for the great lecture. So my question is, I mean, there was quite a lot of examples you gave, and one of them being 8 House by Big, and the other one I was looking also the New Brighton by Neo Wolf. I mean, we all get excited about, including a lot of kind of public or mixed use into our residential buildings. And I think this is one of the things also we are busy tackling in our as a student now in honor class. You mentioned that how the inclusivity in the 8 House was a kind of a failure. Then what would be the best ways? I mean, what would be the best ways actually to come with a resolution where we have a lot of superficial housings and residential buildings, as you mentioned, also even in Waterfall, where still everything is just almost still segregated, like just for the rich. But you mentioned even that there's 27-kilometer wall in Waterfall. It feels like it's just for a certain part of people, but we want to include, I mean, different mixed use or different typologies or what do you call it, different residential people into one place. But what would be the best way where everybody can actually be able to live together, or how can we create that kind of architecture? Thank you.
I think that's a very, very difficult question. And I think what I'd like to outline is that we also struggle in finding the solution. I don't think there is a definitive singular solution. But what I have tried to point out is that in the design, we tend to design in broad strokes. So we move, like if I had to talk about publicness and privateness, we go immediately from public to private. And I think that was one of the failures or the critiques I have of maybe the big scale of Bjarkengel's work. There's tools in the nuances of building in terms of thresholds. There are some very successful older buildings in Johannesburg that start to see housing that you move from publicness as a step into semi-public, into private, the creation of a stoop, the creation of a covered entrance, then another step into a house, a place where you can put a pot plant, the place where you can put a sign, a balcony you can retreat to, have a private space, but overlook into public spaces. So these nuances in public spaces have been stripped away from our toolkit. And that's as a practitioner, but not as you as a student. I think that we should do the hard work by designing the fine grain, because too often we design in broad strokes and the fine grain is neglected step by step into one space into the other. And it's easier said than done. But I think to give credit to the very basic thing, thresholds, steps, communal spaces, public spaces, these are the tools that we have that we need to bring back, and they worked. I mean, the iconic work of Jane Jacobs is still, I mean, it's 50, I don't know, more than 50 or 60 years old, is still relevant. And if we just took some of that as just basic reasonable ways. If we ask people on the ground of how do you want to live, I want to look across the street, I want to I want to sit on a stoop. Those are the small gray nuances that needs to come back into our toolkit.
Thanks, Tanzeem. I'm just going to maybe add to Sirak's question, but Sirak is one of our honors students. We've asked them to look at inclusionary housing, to mix their house across economies, and to have at least 25% affordable housing within their building, which is a dense mixed-use building. What would you say to students about how to deal with inclusionary housing and your thoughts around inclusionary housing? But we're finding this very difficult because it seems the inequalities of our city keep reinforcing themselves. There's always the haves and the served, and those binaries keep coming in. What attitude should they take to affordable inclusionary housing within new dense developments in prime sites close to potential for income, right? So these sites are in Orange Grove and Rosebank. Yeah, just your thought on that. And then I see Lone wants to ask a question, but if you respond, and we can ask Lone to ask her question after.
Yeah, I think what it goes back is, of course, about our attitudes. We face the same attitude in that project that for speculative high-rise development. I'm trying to go to that slide in Cape Town. I think the first thing is to just challenge the attitude. So we immediately start to apply the zoning to different kinds of uses. So affordable housing should have a different lift to the penthouse. And the question would be why? It's only directly related to power. And also perhaps so our solution at the time was that, yes, we need to contest the space, but to bring it back adjacent to each other. I just want to go back to this, adjacent to each other. But if we can create that different kinds of space with the same design palette, so it does not mean that that the affordable housing needs to be it needs to be on a single floor, because that creates labels. So what we tried to do was to make adjacency. So to start to build adjacency of different kinds of units, 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom units alongside each other that will attract different kinds of tenancies. And if you start to remove the labels of penthouse, affordable housing, gap housing, and start to just allocate different sizes adjacent to each other, then the person who is attracted to that kind of space will house it, and it also creates a sense of community. But again, it's easier said than done. There also needs to create a sense of identity. So, or the lack of a lack of what's it called, the word the lack of a sense of the opposite, belonging, of not belonging, of being, that's the affordable housing. So the ostracization of certain housing as lesser. So if we use the same palette of design, it needs to be adjacent and to create adjacency. We suffered and we also dealt with the same kind of struggle. So it's not a struggle. It's a real struggle that creates a sense of belonging in each space, but at the same time creates adjacency, but has to deal with the bringing down our social narratives. And I think that's a long way to go. But my sense, it would not be to create to partitionize spaces, but rather to see it as a holistic community that will grow together.
Okay. Thank you. Lone, before you go, I just want to ask, we'll tell everyone that the CPD link is in the chat and we'll close at 6. And John had typed in his question. It was about the issue around security in urban spaces for these kind of developments. He was saying it's a pity. How do you deal with security? And then after that, we can go to Lone. And Anoop, sorry. Tanzeem, did you get the question on security and urban space?
I didn't hear. Yes, that's the biggest challenge, especially in South Africa. The need, you can create as much as open spaces as you can, but eventually, due to possibly fire and our security needs, the perimeter fencing tends to come up. So our sense is that if you start to move away from the isolated block, where the perimeter fence will immediately surround your building, is to rather define the edges by architecture. So creating a series of thresholds from the public pavement down to the garden, from to the steps to the stoop, etc. So maybe stretching that public-private need. So even if you had to demarcate your private space, it will still create public accessibility. I think these particularities are very particular to individual sites, and they remain a constant issue within all our buildings themselves, particularly the one like in a child care center, where there's a need to create a public open space, but also to protect the needs of the child, or openness to the child. Having said that, we faced exactly that. After a handover, the MEC arrived and there was an electric fence put all around the building. So we've had several failures on our end, including in terms of our housing, but it remains a challenge where we start to stretch that sense from public to private. So even if it was privatized, space or privatized, there's still public accessibility to a point.
Thank you. Lone, if you want to go ahead, and then we can end with Anoop's question.
Okay. Hi, Tanzeem. Thanks very much. Yeah, I think that one of the biggest obstacles to innovation is the kind of regulations. First of all, we think of housing in all these different silos. So there's affordable housing, gap housing, RDP housing, blah, blah, blah. So they also are dealt with as completely separate entities rather than seeing that one could also mix different housing silos in the same building, if that makes sense. And then in their kind of striving to create best practice and standards, you land up with regulations that are completely ridiculous and nonsensical. So, and it also perpetuates the thing of a type. So there's a 1-bedroom house which has to be, or unit which has to be 42 square meters, and a 2-bedroom unit that or 42 and 36, whatever it is. And because those are so strictly adhered to, there's no innovation in the actual designing of units either. And sometimes the plans come out completely nonsensical. So they tick all the boxes in terms of sizes and things, but they make no sense in terms of planning. And particularly not in our situation where there is no such thing as a standard household. So they don't allow for any kind of flexibility in terms of how people use the space or how you accommodate, not a mother and a father and 2 kids, but, 3 sisters and their 4 kids or whatever else it is. So I think those are big obstacles. And I think that we as architects are not doing enough to try and influence those who actually make up those regulations, because they don't allow for flexibility or advocacy in terms of so-called inclusionary housing. The fact that inclusionary housing is 25% for lower income families is completely nonsensical when you need 80%. But the point is, it's about, teaching people that mixing can work, that not being as strict about things as you are can, of course, it presupposes that you've got good designers, I guess. But I don't know, I mean, maybe you could just comment on some of those kinds of obstacles in terms of trying to create more responsive, more sensitive, more flexible units.
You're 100% right, Lone. I think the biggest obstacle for us and whoever's working in the housing space is actually the town planning laws. So while you look at the nodal review, which looks to be quite inclusionary and quite progressive, when you actually start to implement, the parking regulations are completely contradictory to what it says in the nodal review. So yes, you might want to first of all densify the site, but when you do the numbers, that you don't have enough parking bays. So that's just like a rudimentary functional thing. So there's no cohesiveness between the regulation of fire. Someone had brought up security. So the need for security is real and it's unavoidable. But the fire regulation, nobody wants to rationalize that in order to use innovation or even electronic, different devices, that things would be adaptable or rationalize those. So there's conflicting views. And then we have the next level is that we may have laws that regulations that go forward, is that we don't have our regulators, which are the plan examiners, the town planners, and all of the different hoops that we have to jump through, including housing associations. Yeah. All are looking in silos, and they are looking only as in like not in my backyard kind of scenario to protect their own territories, or people are too scared to take on the challenge because it's too big, because someone's going to get into trouble. So that's why plans get missing. I mean, just on a pragmatic, plans go missing, things done, and you'll see so much innovation in the townships because there's less regulation and more innovation because there's no oversight, and no oversight means a good thing in some levels, but no oversight in places like waterfall is also a bad thing. So there needs to be this multidisciplinary approach that has an overview, what creates innovation. And then the biggest thing I would like to advocate is that as architects, we should stop being at the end of the rung. We really need to be the developers. We need to shift that triangle, that pyramid. So we're the developers that start to instigate both the money, the program, and get the funding to do it, because that's the only way to do it, because every other discipline seems to sit above us.
Agreed.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Great question, great answer. Anoop, if you wanted to ask your question, and we could end with that question.
Hi, Tanzeem, thanks for the presentation. I think you've answered the question a bit in part previously. You mentioned that London is a city that's sort of got it right in terms of integration of rich and poor, where the city is obviously inclusive in that sense. But I think here we're getting it horribly wrong, because you find that Johannesburg is now being divided into another Sandton, another Rosebank, another waterfall city. Pretoria is sort of getting fragmented into Centurion and Menlyn. So where are we going wrong? Thank you.
Yeah, so that quote was like advocated by David Ajay, purely because he acknowledged that possibly London, despite its cosmopolitan nature, in his own particular project was starting to contest that isolated, enclaves of rich and poor. So he, in his particular, I think it's the Shoreditch project, if I'm not mistaken. So he was exactly trying to do what we in South Africa face as a dilemma by putting these different conflicting social cohesion, people of different communities adjacent to each other. But that's the big elephant in the room, is that are we ready for it? And I think we are reverting to very territorial. I can't believe that it's quite radical to say, and it shouldn't be radical to say, that you put affordable housing next to a penthouse or in the same building. I mean, they're design tools to separate them, or it's even radical to, there's a flurry of complaints if you have a high density housing development in the suburbs. We've had countless complaints where people hide behind the idea and say non-classist, non-racist background excuses like, oh, it's going to increase traffic. Oh, there's not enough schools. So all of these, we hide behind all of these pragmatic solutions, because the ultimately is that you can't put housing development, you can't add more schools if there's not more density. You can't address densification if you don't have it in the first place. So there's this chicken and egg situation, and it has to start from somewhere. And that's why I think we have it as architects just got to push every time we get a brief. It's very, very difficult as practitioners, and it also puts the sustainability of your own practice. You know what it's like, that you can't say no to certain things, and you can't contesting too much, because we've lost several projects when we were deemed to be too socialist or putting in non-essential functions. But later it comes around that all of these non-essential functions are integral to longer tenancies. So I've learned is to not say everything. I've learned to, the things that we want to put into the designs that we create is to keep it, to embed it in the design, but not speak it out. Because as soon as you say something, people get defensive, but if they don't see it and it's there and ultimately the design works, then you've created those spaces that creates cohesion. But I would never lie and say that it's easy, and it comes at great cost to both the practitioner and to the people who are trying to advocate it. But I think the challenge remains, and we're going to become obsolete as architects if we don't start taking on real problems as you've outlined. So let's become the developers.
Well, thank you. On that note, I want to say thank you to Tanzeem, and I'm just going to read a few words here that are in the chat, highly relevant, very inspiring. Great presentation, wonderful insights, thought-provoking, inspiring, insightful. Yep, that does cover this lecture. I really thank you, Tanzeem, I think Patricia and Namdi, and also to our attendees. Thank you for attending. Please join us again to continue this kind of conversation where we're going to talk about inclusive space with Lwanda Zaso on the 7th of September on Thursday at this time.